My best friend introduced me to a room full of strangers as her husband, and the strangest part wasn't the lie. The strangest part was how naturally I smiled and said, "That's me," like I had been rehearsing the line for years without knowing it. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 32, I design lighting systems for theaters and concert venues, which means I spend most of my life in dark rooms making other things look beautiful while staying invisible myself. That probably explains a few things about how long it took me to notice what was happening in my own life. My best friend's name was Sophie Lawson. We had known each other for 7 years, ever since she sat down at my table in a coffee shop during a blackout because every other seat was taken, and informed me, without asking, that my laptop charger was now hers for the next hour because her phone was dying and she had, quote, main character energy emergencies. I should have known then. Some people walk into your life and you spend years pretending it was casual. Sophie was loud in the rooms that needed it and quiet in the ones that didn't, which is a rarer skill than people think. She had sharp brown eyes, dark hair she always claimed she was growing out and never did, and a laugh that arrived half a second before she meant it to, like her honesty leaked out faster than her composure could catch it. She worked in event planning, which meant she spent her professional life managing other people's chaos and her personal life pretending she had none of her own. For 7 years, we were the kind of friends people misread constantly. Late-night phone calls that lasted longer than some of my relationships. Grocery runs that turned into 2-hour conversations in parking lots. The kind of comfortable silence that only happens when you've stopped performing for each other. People asked if we were together. We always laughed it off. "We're just close," Sophie would say, like that explained the way she remembered my coffee order down to the exact ratio of cream, or the way I always knew when her voice was doing the brave-sounding thing it did right before she fell apart. I didn't examine that too closely. Some questions you avoid because you suspect the answer will cost you something. There had been small moments over the years, the kind you only notice in hindsight once someone hands you a flashlight. The time she showed up at my apartment at 2 in the morning after a bad breakup and fell asleep on my couch instead of going home, and I sat in the chair across from her for an hour just watching her breathe instead of going to bed myself. The time I brought a date to her birthday dinner and spent the entire night watching Sophie's face instead of the woman sitting next to me, and told myself it was just protectiveness, the way you'd watch out for any close friend. The time she cried in my car after her father's funeral and gripped my hand so hard it left marks, and I didn't mind the marks at all. Looking back, there were 100 small warnings stacked on top of each other, and I had spent 7 years calling the pile friendship because it was easier to live inside a familiar word than to question whether the word still fit. So when Sophie called me on a Thursday night sounding more rattled than I'd heard her in years, I assumed it was work. It wasn't. "I need a favor," she said. "A big one. The kind where you're allowed to say no, but I will be sad about it for the rest of my life." That's a generous amount of pressure for a Thursday. My cousin's wedding is this weekend. The one in Connecticut. I told you about it. The one with the family that treats marriage like a report card. That one, she said. I need a date. You have plenty of friends who'd. I need a date who my family will believe is serious. Someone who won't fold the second my mother starts interrogating him about 5-year plans. Someone who already knows enough about my life not to get caught in a lie. I leaned back against my kitchen counter, already smiling in the way you do right before you agree to something reckless. So basically, you need an actor with inside information. Basically, I need you. I told her yes before I let myself think about why saying yes felt like the easiest decision I'd made all year. What she didn't tell me, not fully, not until we were already in the car driving up on Friday afternoon, was the size of the performance she actually needed. There's something else, she said, eyes on the road, knuckles a little too tight on the wheel. That sentence is never followed by good news. My ex is going to be there. The one who left 2 weeks before our engagement party because he, quote, needed to find himself in Portugal. Yes. That one. Daniel. And your family doesn't know it ended that badly? My family thinks I left him. I let them think that because the alternative was watching my mother's face do the thing it does when she feels sorry for me. Sophie exhaled hard. And Daniel is going to be at this wedding with his new fiancée, and my mother already texted me twice this week asking if I was, quote, bringing anyone serious, because apparently being 31 and unmarried at a family wedding is treated like a structural failure in this family. So the plan is? The plan is you're my husband. I nearly swerved into the next lane. Your what? Boyfriend felt too flimsy. My mother would spend a whole weekend asking if it's serious. Husband ends the conversation before it starts. Sophie, that's not a slight escalation, that's a different country. I know. I panicked when I texted my mother back. I said the word before I thought it through. Now there's no taking it back without it looking like the marriage failed in under a week, which honestly might be worse. I should have argued. I should have laid out, calmly, every reason this idea was a controlled demolition waiting for a match. Instead, I looked over at her, at the way her jaw was set like she was bracing for me to say no, and I heard myself say, do I get a ring budget, or are we doing this on theater tech wages? Her whole face changed. Relief, then something else underneath it that I filed away and didn't examine, because examining things had apparently become my least favorite hobby that year. There's a ring in my bag, she admitted. I bought a cheap one at the mall on the way to your apartment. I'm sorry, I should have asked first. You should have asked a lot of things first. I panicked. You said that. I'm saying it again because it's still true. I laughed despite myself, and that was the moment the whole ridiculous plan stopped feeling like a favor and started feeling like the beginning of something I didn't have a name for yet. The rehearsal dinner happened the night before the actual wedding, in a smaller room off the same barn, strung with the kind of warm amber lighting I would have critiqued mercilessly on any other night if I hadn't been technically off duty and trying very hard not to look like a man assessing color temperature instead of celebrating his best friend's cousin. Sophie squeezed my arm as we walked in. Last chance to back out, she whispered. I can still tell everyone you got food poisoning and had to drive home. And miss watching you improvise an entire marriage in real time. Never. You make it sound so glamorous. I'm a professional. I make terrible ideas look intentional for a living. It's basically the same skill set as lighting a stage so badly built sets look expensive. She laughed, and the sound carried just far enough that her cousin Jenna, the bride, turned around and caught us mid-laugh, mid-touch, looking exactly like two people who had been married far longer than the story we were about to tell everyone. You two are disgustingly cute, Jenna said. I'm almost annoyed it's not my wedding people are going to be staring at tomorrow. Nobody's staring at us, I said. Everyone is staring at you, Jenna said. Sophie brought a date to literally nothing for 6 years straight, and now she shows up married out of nowhere. People had bets going in the family group chat. Bets, Sophie repeated weakly. Pam had money on you being secretly engaged to your old college boyfriend. My mom had money on you showing up alone and pretending you preferred it that way. Nobody, and I mean nobody, had money on actual husband. You owe the pool an explanation at some point this weekend. We'll explain everything at brunch tomorrow, I said, before Sophie could panic out loud, and I felt her relax slightly against my side, grateful for the deflection even though we both knew it was only delaying the inevitable. We stayed late at the rehearsal dinner, long enough to watch Jenna's father cry through a toast and long enough for Pam to corner us near the bar with a glass of wine in one hand and a look in her eye that suggested she had already started building her own theory of the case. You two don't act married, she said, studying us. You act like people who are still deciding whether they're allowed to. That's an oddly specific observation for someone holding their third glass of Pinot, Sophie said. I notice things, Pam said. It's my one talent. That, and ruining brunch. You haven't ruined brunch yet, I said. Technically that's tomorrow. Pam raised her glass like I'd just made a toast worth honoring. I like him, she announced to no one in particular. Husband or not, I like him. By the time we left the rehearsal dinner, walking back to the small inn down the road with our shoes in our hands because Sophie had declared the gravel path a heels emergency, something had already shifted between us that neither of us had a name for yet. We didn't talk about it. We just kept walking slower than we needed to, in no hurry to reach the part of the night where we'd have to stop pretending we weren't enjoying the pretending. The wedding venue was an old restored barn an hour outside Hartford, the kind of place with string lights and a guest list that treated subtlety like a personal insult. Sophie's family arrived in waves of expensive cardigans and opinions. Her mother, Carol, found us within 4 minutes of our arrival, moving through the crowd like a woman who had been training for this moment since Sophie was 17. "There she is," Carol said, then her eyes landed on me, and her whole posture changed. "And this must be Ethan." "Hi, Mrs. Lawson." "Carol," she corrected immediately, eyes already scanning my hand for a ring I had, thankfully, remembered to put on. "Sophie mentioned you on the phone, very briefly, very mysteriously, and then suddenly we're hearing the word husband, and I have approximately 400 questions." "Mom," Sophie said, in the exact tone of a woman defusing a bomb she had built herself. "I'm allowed to be surprised, Sophie. You eloped." "We didn't elope," I said smoothly, slipping my arm around Sophie's waist like I'd done it 1,000 times instead of 0. "We just don't believe in making things a production. Sophie plans everyone else's big days for a living. She didn't want one of her own." Carol's eyes softened slightly at that, and I felt Sophie's hand find mine, gripping it like a woman steadying herself on a railing. "That," Carol said slowly, "actually sounds exactly like her." It was a good lie because it wasn't entirely a lie. That was the thing about Sophie. Everything I said about her came easily because none of it required invention. I just had to reach for the truth and reshape it slightly. For the first hour, the performance felt almost fun. We answered questions as a unit, finishing each other's sentences with the kind of ease 7 years of friendship makes look effortless. We told people we met at a coffee shop, which was true. We told people I stole her charger, which was the opposite of true but made Carol laugh so hard she had to sit down. Sophie squeezed my hand under the table during dinner whenever a question got too close to real history, and every time she did it, something in my chest pulled tighter than it should have for a fake marriage. Then Daniel found us near the dessert table, his new fiancée trailing slightly behind him like an accessory he'd selected to match the evening. "Sophie." His voice had the practiced warmth of a man who wanted an audience for his own grace. "Wow. You look incredible." "Daniel." Sophie's voice didn't waver, but I felt her spine straighten beside me. "And this must be." He turned to me, extending a hand with too much enthusiasm. "The husband." "Wow. That happened fast." "Some things don't need to be slow to be right," I said, shaking his hand exactly hard enough to make a point without making a scene. Daniel's smile thinned slightly. "Funny, you never mentioned anyone serious before, sophomore. Last I heard you were focused on your career. Very independent." "Very, what was the word you used, unattached?" There it was. The small cruelty disguised as memory. Sophie's hand tightened around mine. "People grow," I said, before Sophie had to find her own answer. "Some people just take longer to recognize what was already right in front of them." I wasn't looking at Daniel when I said it. I was looking at Sophie. And for one unguarded second, her eyes went wide and something passed between us that had nothing to do with the act we were supposed to be performing. Daniel cleared his throat, sensing he'd lost whatever game he thought he was playing. "Well. Congratulations, you two. Truly." He didn't sound like he meant it, but he also didn't stay long enough to keep proving it. When he was gone, Sophie exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since dinner started. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't think he'd actually be that." "You don't have to apologize for him being exactly who you said he was. You didn't have to do that, the whole, some people take longer to recognize what was right in front of them, thing. That was a lot." I know. Did you mean it as a performance, or? I should have answered quickly. I didn't, because the honest answer scared me more than the lie we'd already built our entire weekend on. I don't know yet, I said. Ask me again after the open bar closes. That made her laugh, the real kind, the kind that arrived too fast for her to control, and for the rest of the night neither of us mentioned Daniel again. The real trouble started the next morning, at brunch, when Sophie's Aunt Pam, 2 mimosas deep and operating with the confidence of a woman who had never once regretted speaking her mind, leaned across the table and said, "So when's the big celebration? You can't just elope and not throw a party. People will think you're hiding something." Sophie's smile flickered. "We're still figuring out logistics." "Logistics," Pam repeated, unconvinced. "When did you two actually get married? Sophie, you didn't even tell your mother the date." The table went quiet in that specific way tables go quiet when everyone is doing math they shouldn't be doing out loud. Carol's eyes sharpened with interest she was trying very hard to disguise as casual curiosity. "It was small," I said smoothly, reaching for the closest believable detail. "Courthouse. A Tuesday. We didn't want the date to feel like a performance for other people." "What Tuesday?" I felt the trap close before I saw it. 3 weeks ago, Sophie said quickly, too quickly. 5 weeks, I said at the same time. The table went very still. Pam's eyebrows rose so high they nearly left her face entirely. Carol set down her mimosa with the precision of a woman preparing for war. 3 or 5? Carol asked. Sophie's face went the color of the tablecloth. I felt the entire fragile structure of our story begin to creak, and somewhere underneath the panic, I felt something else too. Relief, almost. Like part of me had been waiting for an excuse to stop pretending. "Okay," Sophie said, setting her fork down with the calm of someone choosing to jump rather than be pushed. "Okay. I need to tell you something. Sophie." I said her name like a warning, though I wasn't sure what I was warning her against. "No," she said. "I'm done doing the math in my head every time someone asks a follow-up question." She looked at her mother. "We're not married." Pam gasped like she'd been personally betrayed by the brunch menu. Carol's face did something complicated, somewhere between confusion and the specific anger reserved for people who feel foolish in public. "Then what?" Carol said slowly, "have we been celebrating for 2 days?" I panicked, Sophie said. "Daniel was going to be here. You kept asking if I was bringing someone serious. I didn't want to spend the entire wedding being the divorced one everyone feels sorry for, so I called Ethan and I said the word husband before I thought about what it actually meant, and he was kind enough to go along with it because that is the kind of person Ethan is." The table absorbed this in silence. Carol looked at me, then at Sophie, then back at me with the expression of a woman recalculating an entire weekend's worth of assumptions. "So you're not married," Carol said. "No. But you are." "We're." Sophie hesitated, and I watched her search for the word, and I realized I was searching for it too. "We're something. I don't actually know what to call it. We're real friends pretending to be a married couple who, somewhere over the last 2 days, stopped feeling entirely like pretending." I hadn't expected her to say that part out loud. Apparently, neither had she, because her hand flew briefly to her mouth like she could take it back. Carol looked at me. "Is that true?" There were a dozen safe answers available. I didn't reach for any of them. "Yes," I said. "It's true. I don't know what we are either. But I know it stopped being an act somewhere around the part where Daniel tried to make her feel small, and I realized I would have said everything I said even if no one was watching." The table was silent except for the soft clink of someone's fork against a plate 3 tables over. Pam, to her credit, recovered first. "Well," she said, refilling her mimosa, "this is the best brunch I've been to in years." Carol wasn't laughing. She studied Sophie for a long moment, the way mothers do when they're deciding whether to be angry or relieved. You lied to me about a marriage, she said finally, to avoid looking lonely in front of a man who left you 2 weeks before your engagement party. Yes. That is, genuinely, one of the most Sophie things you have ever done. Sophie let out a breath that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I know. Carol's eyes moved to me again, softer now. And you went along with it because... Because she asked, I said. And because some part of me has wanted a reason to stand next to her and mean it for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Sophie turned to look at me fully then, brunch and family and Pam's mimosa forgotten entirely. You mean that? I've meant most of what I said this weekend, I told her. I just didn't know I was allowed to say it outside the act. The rest of brunch happened around us in a blur I genuinely couldn't recall afterward. Carol asked Pam to please stop narrating the situation to the rest of the table. Pam ignored her. Somewhere in the noise, Sophie reached for my hand under the table again, except this time there was no audience left to perform for, and she held it anyway. We left the reception early that evening, walking out past the string lights into a parking lot that smelled like cut grass and late summer. Neither of us spoke until we reached my car. I owe you an apology, Sophie said, leaning against the passenger door. I dragged you into something enormous because I was scared of looking pathetic in front of people who already think the worst of how my life turned out. You didn't drag me anywhere I didn't choose to go. I called you my husband in front of my entire extended family. You did. And you didn't correct it for almost 2 days. I noticed that too, eventually. I leaned against the car beside her, close enough to feel the warmth coming off her skin in the cooling evening air. I kept waiting for the moment it would start feeling like a lie I was uncomfortable telling. It never came. Sophie turned to face me fully. Why not? Because I think I've been quietly rehearsing the role for longer than this weekend, I admitted. I just never had a reason to say the lines out loud until your mother forced the issue at brunch. That's either the most romantic thing you've ever said to me, or the most concerning. Why not both? She laughed, soft and a little shaky, and the sound of it undid something in my chest that I'd kept carefully tied down for years. Ethan. Yeah. If I asked you to actually mean it. Not the wedding version. Not the version for Pam and my mother. The real version, slow, terrifying, no fake rings from the mall. Would you want that? I reached for her hand, the same hand that had been gripping mine under tables and across dinner tables for 2 days straight, except this time there was nothing to perform and no one left to convince. I think, I said, I've wanted that since you stole my charger and decided that made us close. I just spent 7 years calling it friendship because the real word felt too big to survive saying out loud. Her eyes went bright in the porch light spilling out from the barn behind us. Say the real word, then. I love you, I said. Not as a performance. Not because Daniel was being cruel and I wanted to win an argument in front of your family. Because somewhere over the last 2 days, every fake detail I invented about us turned out to be something I actually wanted to be true. Sophie didn't answer right away. She just stepped closer, slow enough that I had every chance to second guess it, and she didn't give me the chance to. She kissed me instead, soft and certain, the kind of kiss that answers a question instead of asking one. When we finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine and laughed quietly. Worst fake marriage in the history of fake marriages. Genuinely catastrophic, I agreed. We lasted approximately 48 hours before collapsing into the truth in front of your entire family. Best 48 hours of my year, though. Mine too. We drove home that night with the windows down and the radio low, and somewhere around the Connecticut border, Sophie reached over and laced her fingers through mine without explanation, the same way she had at the wedding, except now there was nothing fake holding it together. The weeks after the wedding were strange in the way real things often are after you've spent days performing a louder version of them for an audience. We didn't rush to define anything publicly. We didn't need to. Sophie still called me after long days at work, except now she didn't pretend the calls were about logistics. I still showed up at her apartment with takeout on nights she didn't ask me to, except now I stopped pretending it was just what friends did. Our first actual date happened almost 2 weeks after the wedding, and it was, by any reasonable measure, a disaster. I picked a restaurant too formal for two people who had spent the last 7 years arguing over who owed who for gas station coffee, and Sophie showed up in a dress that made me forget, twice, what I was supposed to be saying mid-sentence. We sat across from each other for the first 20 minutes like strangers auditioning for roles we'd already been cast in years ago, both of us too aware of the cameras that weren't there anymore. "This is weird," Sophie finally admitted, setting down her menu. "We've had 1,000 dinners together. Why does this one feel like a final exam?" "Because for the first time, neither of us has an audience to blame it on," I said. "No Pam. No Carol. No Daniel to perform against. Just us, deciding in real time whether this is something we actually want, instead of something we backed into." Sophie was quiet for a moment, turning her water glass in slow circles. "Can I tell you something that's going to sound ungrateful? Always. Part of me misses the lie a little. Not because it wasn't terrifying, but because the lie came with an excuse built in. If it had fallen apart, we could have blamed the performance. Now if this falls apart, it's just us. No story to hide behind." I reached across the table and took her hand, the same hand I'd been holding at family dinners and parking lots and 100 ordinary nights I'd never let myself name properly. "Then let's stop treating it like something that needs an excuse," I said. "I don't want a version of you I have to perform around. I want the version that stole my charger and never apologized for it." That got the laugh I'd been waiting for all night, the real one, too fast to be polite. I did genuinely never apologize for that. I noticed. "I'm not going to start now. I wouldn't want you to." By the time dessert arrived, the formality had cracked entirely, replaced by the easy rhythm we'd spent 7 years building without realizing we were building anything at all. We left the restaurant that night holding hands without performing it for anyone, which felt, somehow, like a bigger milestone than the entire wedding weekend had been. Carol called Sophie twice that first week, both times to ask, with surprising gentleness, whether the fake marriage had become a real relationship yet, and both times Sophie told her to mind her own business, which Carol correctly interpreted as a yes. 3 months in, Daniel sent Sophie a single, awkward text wishing her well, clearly having heard through the family grapevine that the fake husband had become an actual boyfriend. Sophie showed me the text, laughed once, and deleted it without replying. "Some apologies aren't worth the effort of responding to," she said, and I didn't argue. We moved in together the following spring, mostly because Sophie's lease ended and neither of us could justify pretending 2 separate apartments still made sense when most nights we ended up in the same one anyway. She brought too many event planning binders. I brought too many lighting catalogs. We compromised by building a shared bookshelf neither of us has ever fully organized. A year after the wedding where it all started, Sophie's cousin invited us back to the same barn for an anniversary party, and Carol cornered me near the same dessert table where Daniel had once tried to make Sophie feel small. "You know," she said, sipping her wine, "I still can't decide if I'm furious you lied to me at brunch, or grateful that the lie turned into this. Can it be both?" Carol smiled, an echo of the conversation Sophie and I had had in that same parking lot a year earlier. Apparently that's becoming a popular answer in this family. 2 years after the wedding, I proposed to Sophie in that same barn, during the same cousin's second anniversary party, because apparently we are exactly the kind of people who turn coincidence into tradition. I didn't buy the ring from a mall this time. I'd been saving for months, terrified and certain in equal measure, and when I got down on one knee near the same dessert table, Sophie laughed so hard she nearly knocked over a tray of cake before she managed to say yes. "This feels like cheating," she said through tears and laughter. "We already did the husband thing. We skipped straight to round 2. Consider it a long engagement," I told her. "Started 2 years ago, with a fake ring and a true story neither of us was ready to admit yet. She married me for real 8 months later, in a small ceremony with an actual date that nobody had to lie about, and during her toast, Carol stood up and said, to my daughter, who once told an entire family she was married to spare herself one uncomfortable conversation, and somehow ended up with the realest marriage I've ever watched happen in front of me. Pam, predictably, refilled her glass and said it was still the best brunch story she'd ever lived through. People ask us sometimes how we actually got together, and Sophie always tells it the same way. I introduced him as my husband to avoid an awkward conversation with my ex, and then I accidentally fell in love with the lie. I usually add, I just said yes to the role until it stopped being one. Both versions are true. Neither one is the whole story. The whole story is that sometimes the safest lie you tell is the one built entirely out of things you were already too afraid to say honestly, and sometimes the only thing standing between friendship and something bigger is one ridiculous favor neither of you takes back. So tell me, what would you have done if your best friend introduced you as her husband in front of an entire family, with zero warning, and expected you to play along for an entire weekend? And have you ever found out that a lie you were telling for someone else's sake was actually the truth you've been too scared to say first? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.